The world is changing fast, and so are the local real estate markets. Don't worry, though. We've got you covered. Welcome to the Real Estate Revolution.
Hey. Welcome back to the Real Estate Revolution. I am Kip Lohr, your host with Lohr Real Estate, and we have a great show for you today. We are going to be talking with Dylan Lamar of Cultivate, Inc. We are going to talk middle housing, the missing middle. And trust me, we'll get to what that means later on in the show. But before we get started with our interview with Dylan, as always, we have our patented Lohr Real Estate Weekly Market Report with Ryan Neal. So, Ryan, why don't you go ahead and take it away and let us know what's gone on in the last week in real estate in both Redmond and Bend area and Eugene, Springfield area.
We'll start, like usual, with the latest on 30-year fixed mortgage rates. So last week, we reported that local rates were all the way up in the mid 5% range. In other words, there's been quite the dramatic jump just in a very short chunk of time. Well, that's still just about where we're at this week. As a financed buyer, that means that you have significantly less purchasing power than you would have just earlier in the year. Meanwhile, prices haven't dropped in any of our local markets. We'll go into that, but the long and short is that you'll need to recalibrate. It's important to get in touch with a local lender and have them run the numbers again so you have a true sense of your purchasing power if you're looking for a home right now. With that out of the way, the numbers are in for the first week and a half of April. So sale prices in Eugene are significantly higher than last month's pending sales would have indicated. The median so far is all the way up to $510,000. So the implication there is that homes are selling for significantly more than their list price, and this obviously is because of bidding wars. So there's another item that stands out from our recent data. Eugene's inventory was increasing slowly but surely through March, but it's taken another dive in April. As of today, there are only 103 active homes for sale in Eugene, and their median ask price is $515,000. So, to make a long story short, all signs are pointing right now to Eugene's market heating up. It's not cooling down, in spite of headlines you might be reading that the housing market is, that's what it's experiencing right now. Real estate is local. In Springfield, it's basically the same situation. Inventory is down to just 44 active properties. Sale prices are up to just under $450,000 as a median, and the new listings that we're seeing in April have a median ask price of $467,000. So one thing to note is that higher-end inventory is coming back on the market in Springfield after we had a real drought of that, a real shortage of that all throughout March. In Bend, inventory is continuing to rise somewhat. It's far from a fire sale at this point, and really more just in line with the usual seasonal trend where we see more homes coming onto the market in Bend in the spring. Pending sales are back up, though, to a median of $794,000. That indicates that the lower sale prices that we saw in March were probably just a short-lived trend, and that's happening regardless of the mortgage rate increases we're seeing. In Redmond, homes at the lower half of the market are continuing to be bought up, while new listings are trending toward the upper half of Redmond's market. The overall inventory is up slightly in Redmond, though not nearly as much as it is in Bend, and what is available has a median ask of just under $650,000, so not too much below what we're seeing in Bend. The picture, of course, is constantly changing, and that's why we're bringing you these updates every week. So stay tuned and keep on listening for the main part of our show just coming up.
Welcome back to the Real Estate Revolution podcast. I am Kip Lohr, your host with Lohr Real Estate, and it is time to get into the meat of the matter. Our special guest in the house today, Dylan Lamar with Cultivate, Inc. We are going to talk about middle housing. And I guess to start off, how you doing?
I'm doing pretty well. It's good to be joining you here in the studio.
Yeah, so Dylan is a local to Eugene area architect, developer, specializing in energy efficient and affordable housing. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so why don't you start out by just telling us a little bit about you and what you're doing here in Eugene.
Okay.
Then we'll kick into the topic.
Yeah. So I was in Portland, started out in architecture up there for about 8 years with Green Hammer, doing sustainable design and construction, energy efficiency consulting for other architects kind of nationwide. And about 3 or 4 years ago, moved back down to Eugene to really focus more on affordability, housing affordability. Just seeing kind of the disconnect between what gets built as sustainable architecture and who can afford to live in sustainable architecture. Really, that disconnect is pretty real. And so I've kind of decided to set out on being a developer in order to develop the kind of projects I wanted to design, because there just weren't, as an architect, you're beholden to whatever client comes to your door to hire you. And so the people weren't coming asking me to design what I wanted to design. So I kind of selfishly was like, well, I'm just going to figure out how to do this then.
You're going to create your own market.
Yeah.
And so you've been in Eugene now for how long?
It's been it might even be 5 years now. Yeah.
And you just finished not that long ago one of your first projects since you've been here.
Yeah, my first substantial development, the C Street Co-op, we finished last fall in Springfield. And we can definitely get into that a little later.
Yeah, great. So today we are going to dive into this mystical, magical mystery of middle housing, or the missing middle. For those of you out there that don't know what the missing middle or middle housing is, what would you say we're talking about here?
Yeah, middle housing, the middle housing we're talking about with Oregon's new law that's coming into effect here this summer is going to allow everything between duplexes up to fourplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters on pretty much every residential lot in the city. This is happening statewide in all cities of any size statewide, and each city is kind of implementing a minimum standard of middle housing allowances. That's re-legalizing forms of housing we used to develop by right, but were made illegal through the decades, kind of starting in the 20s. So
why don't you give us a little bit of that history so that we can have some context why we're kind of where we are today as far as the zoning laws that we have had traditionally up until recently, and how that's affected the kind of that middle of the housing milieu.
Totally. Starting in the 20s and increasingly up to the 50s, we basically, our housing zoning laws started to make illegal things like duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhouses, and such, and has really cut out all the middle housing types. And so we created a very segregated zoning system where you have single family, detached, low density housing on one end of the spectrum. And that's the bulk of the land area of our community. It's what we commonly feel as suburbs.
Right.
And then at the other far end of the spectrum is medium and high density residential, which is typically apartment buildings. And
right.
That's a whole rich topic in itself, but some of the important things to mention are that it was very intentionally segregated to keep typically white, affluent people in the nicer neighborhoods and everyone else in the higher density housing, typically less desirable areas. The other important impact, especially when it comes to climate change, is it meant you needed a car to get anywhere. There's no historic example of low density single family housing anywhere in the world prior to this period. And it really was only allowed because of automobile transportation.
Right.
So part of a conundrum now, as we figure out how to reduce our carbon emissions, is how do we support a low density housing fabric without burning gasoline to get everywhere?
Right. And so these laws essentially encouraged the use of cars to get around and discouraged certain members of the population to have home ownership.
Right.
Or if they had home ownership, they were in these more multifamily, some of the missing middle, because there were duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes that kind of popped up, but obviously not in a large enough amount to make much of a difference. But this kind of segregation has got us to the place where it's created inaffordability for a large chunk of the folks, actually regardless of color at this point. It's not really,
and that's the really interesting part of it is that historically it was very intentionally unaffordable to the bottom half, but we've we're tripping over our own shoelaces in terms of now even relatively well-to-do white folks are being priced out.
Yeah.
And so it's becoming, it's always been a crisis. It's just not been one that we necessarily had the political will to address.
Right.
And now we do, because so many people are feeling it. The other thing to mention is that the racial wealth gap is greater now than it was in the 1960s as a result of people of color not having homeownership access over the past, 50 plus years. That means, generational wealth has not accumulated for them the way it has for most white families. So that's kind of the history of the zoning situation. But now we're in this place of, because of the urban growth boundary and combined with the low density housing laws that basically suppress housing from being built, you've got a supply and demand crunch like we've never seen before.
Right.
And that's just driving housing prices through the roof. So the affordability index of what an average family can afford relative to what the average home price is just dramatically diverging in the last couple decades.
Yeah, and there's always been a disparity there. And if you look at the track of the lines, there's always been this gap between the two. They're not in alignment ever.
Yeah.
But just, I would say in the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen just a dramatic increase in the prices because of the lack of inventory, the law of supply and demand. And so, like you're saying, the state of Oregon is trying to address some of this mandated on a state level, came out with the Senate bill requiring easier terms for people that were interested in doing ADUs. And then this Senate bill that's allowing this middle housing to be able to have a foothold. And so today, what we're really talking about is like, what does that really mean for this community? Like, what is the state saying that the city of Eugene or all of the cities of a certain population are now requiring, and how you think we're going to see this get implemented here in a way that isn't scary for people that are going to have resistance of, it's normal to be afraid of change, scared that the quality, the ambiance of your neighborhood is going to be negatively impacted. And I think that, we can show today that maybe it's not as scary as it sounds.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So where we're at in Eugene is the Planning Commission, which is the committee that advises City Council on all things related to land use planning, has published a set of their recommendations to City Council about how they recommend that the middle housing laws be implemented. And really cool thing about that process is that for the first time in Eugene's history, the advisory panel that advised the Planning Commission, this is a multi-year process that's been in the works up to now. So it's not something that happened without much thinking. Quite the contrary, a number of, I forget exactly, I want to say it was over 20 people are on this advisory panel. And for the first time ever, this is not just your retired white homeowners showing up voluntarily to
give their 2 cents
to basically make sure their neighborhood stays the way it's always been.
Right.
The city got a grant from the state, and they were actually able to do a lottery selection process to bring together a demographically representative advisory panel. So the people on the advisory panel are not your typical city committee. It's younger folks, it's people of color, as well as the more usual suspects. And it's pretty cool if you Google Eugene middle housing, you can see a few video interviews, kind of testimonials with some of the advisory panels.
Folks. Yeah.
It's pretty neat because, there's some young 20 somethings. They're like, I've never been involved in city process at all, but I got this interesting letter and I'm hurting to pay my rent. And so I thought maybe getting involved would be a good idea. So it's a beautiful example of democracy at work.
Yeah.
So all that to say, what's embodied in the Planning Commission recommendations now is a very diverse set of voices that's unusual. And what the Planning Commission recommendations overall have done, well, let me back up. And so the state law basically sets a minimum floor and says everybody has to allow this minimum set of things. And those minimums are things like fourplex on most lots, a duplex on every lot is allowed. Cottage cluster and townhouses are allowed on most lots, depending on their size.
Depending on the size of the lot, right.
Things like parking requirements, they've made some minimums. For example, with a fourplex, you can't require more than one off-street parking spot per dwelling unit.
Right.
You can require less. You can choose to require less, but you can't require more than that. And in general, the tack they've taken, which I think is really smart, is anything that you allow a single-family house to do, you have to allow middle housing types to do
At minimum.
At minimum.
Right.
So
you're not discriminating against this new middle housing legislation by saying we're going to create rules that will discourage this from happening.
Exactly. Because, it's really easy to write a little, we call them poison pills, oh, you can build that fourplex, but you're going to need two off-street parking spots per unit. And that's going to basically
Kill
mean
the deal.
Yeah. So anything you allow a single family or require of single family, you have to do the same for middle housing. So the Planning Commission basically has a pretty modest set of recommendations, I would say. They have done the very minimum on many things, such as setback requirements are the same as they are for single family, 10 feet from the street, 5 feet from the side lot lines. Your buildings has to be set back that far. Sorry if I use industry jargon.
No worries. No, people will follow the gist. No worries. Yeah.
With height, total building height, they allow a pretty modest additional 5 feet for middle housing types. That's not really a big deal. It'll be hard to squeeze in an additional floor with only 5 feet, but it will allow for more flexibility to deal with, sites that are on a slope and that kind of thing. The other important ones to mention are, again, they've done mostly the state, kind of the minimum bar, but with parking, they did a really important one where, they require the state minimum unless you're doing smaller and more affordable housing units. And this has been the general case with all of their recommendations, is anywhere they've deviated from the state minimums, they've done so because they want to see more smaller and affordable housing units.
And to be clear, we're talking about the recommendations that came through this committee for Eugene.
Exactly.
Eugene
Yeah. This is Eugene. Yeah.
Yeah. And we're talking about the delineation between the state saying, look, this is the minimum requirements that you have to allow for. If you want to be more generous and more inclusive of these types of developments, you can create go nuts on that front. If you want to make it easier, we're totally happy that you make it easier. So what you're saying is that when it comes to the parking, they're actually encouraging this higher density development by not requiring the same parking requirements that you would for a single family.
If you're doing smaller and more affordable housing.
That's right.
Yeah. If you're doing, more conventional luxury, higher end stuff, you need the same amount of parking as the state minimum, which is about one space per unit.
But this is a deliberate attempt to create more affordable housing.
Yeah.
In a meaningful way.
In a meaningful way.
Right.
One other area that off-street parking requirements are waived is near transit corridors. So again, and this is a look at, again, reducing our carbon emissions. Do we need to provide off-street parking when there's easy transit? It's a kind of a chicken and egg thing. Today you would say, well, yeah, actually, I don't want to take the bus. But if we're ever going to make bus service efficient and actually functional for most people, you got to get people using the bus. So
when you say near a transit corridor, what sort of proximity to bus stops? I'm assuming that's what we're talking about, is how close to a bus stop is this development?
Yeah, I forget exactly. I want to say it's a quarter mile, which is about a 15-minute walk.
Wow.
Yeah.
I mean, that's generous.
It is.
There's most places in the city limits are probably within a 50-minute walk to a bus stop.
Totally. It's quite a lot of area, but the thing to remember is this is a legally required parking space. It does not mean that what a developer is going to build is not going to have parking if it's not required.
No, I get it.
Because developers will deliver what the market demands generally.
Right. But when we talk about your C Street development that you finished last year, this is a great example of the density where you couldn't have built what you did if the parking requirements were making you have a parking spot for each unit.
Right. Totally. Yeah. What off-street parking requirements do is really pit cars against people and housing in a really nasty way.
Getting roofs over heads.
Yeah, right. Exactly. A car parking space costs in the neighborhood of $10,000 to develop. And so when you tack that on, not only are you losing the land area, potentially cutting down trees for that land, but you're also tacking on a pretty hefty price tag to the cost of the housing attached to.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So that's the parking one. Basically, they're waiving parking requirements if you're doing small, that's less than 900 square foot footprint housing, affordable housing, or your near transit line. The design standards, they have some minimum design standards. They've kept those same as state requirements. Lot coverage is another one where they made a modest additional allowance for middle housing, where your typical single family lot, you're allowed to develop 50% of your lot area with building or impervious area.
Right.
With this middle housing, they're going to allow an additional 25% of lot coverage. And that really makes sense because most lots have a house already on them. Yeah. And so if you want to see more housing on that lot, you kind of need to allow a little more lot coverage to do that.
Totally.
Yeah. That's the bulk of it. It's really pretty simple. The same setback supply. We've got a little more height allowed. The parking may or may not be required depending on what kind of housing you develop. And again, if it's smaller, more affordable housing, we're going to waive that requirement. And the lot coverage has increased slightly. Anything else? Also, the lot size. So minimum lot size is kind of a tool to, historically, it's been a tool to exclude. But these days, it's essentially a de facto way of balancing density.
Right.
They are allowing slightly more density, again, if you are doing smaller housing or affordable housing.
Got it.
It's not dramatic. It's around 25% bonus. It's not huge. A couple other things I might mention that people are often interested in are tree preservation. The tree preservation requirements that apply to single-family housing will also apply to middle housing. Those requirements in Eugene right now are not terribly stringent, but that's also because most homeowners don't want the city telling them what they can and can't do with their property.
Totally.
The other thing I would say is that we have to balance our requirements for tree protections against the need for housing. And that's not an easy equation. And it's not one that's easily addressed, I think, through just a law. It's something you kind of have to take it on a case by case basis. And certainly I think we should not be using tree preservation as a weapon against housing, which is how I would say many folks in our community would like to see tree preservation laws used.
Sure.
Historic districts, all the same historic requirements that apply to single family housing will apply to middle housing.
But we're still allowing those types of developments in these historic districts. They just have to comply with whatever the historic district regulations are. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
To me, that's extraordinary, that they've even gone into that because, there could be an argument made that by changing around the density within these historic districts, you're changing the historic district.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah. I think that's cool.
I'm interested to see how that, I haven't yet worked on a project in a historic district to see how that's going to be interpreted. But I know, for example, having worked on a historic property in Portland, we could do an ADU, but we couldn't make it visible from the street.
Right.
So it does have some pretty dramatic impact on actual what you can build.
Yeah, but already the city of Eugene has older duplexes that started out as these 2-story kind of like turn of the century homes, 1905 homes that were porch out front and they get converted into a duplex. Yeah. Now you got 2 front doors instead of 1 front door, but the structure actually looks pretty much original, and you just have now a duplex. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for those types of developments within the city limits here that would be cool.
Totally. Yeah. I think there would be some interesting work for house flippers to transition to the world of going in and converting a big house into a 4-plex or something.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
And then one other point I didn't mention is that, which is really important when it comes to homeownership, is allowing the subdivision of lots. So that's
a huge one, actually.
It's huge, yeah. So this is a second state law that came down that said if you are allowed to develop, for example, a 4-plex on a property, you must be allowed to divide that property into 4 lots so that each home can be on its own lot. And even if they're attached, you can
have
still
a landlocked
you can still have
unit.
You can still do that. You can have a landlocked backyard lot. Yeah. It's got to have an access easement to the street.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to have necessarily parking to it.
Right.
And that's huge because, as you know, the conventional single-family mortgage is king in terms of the world of financing. It's
100%.
the best financing you can get, and and it's heavily subsidized by a whole industry, has been for decades. So it's important that middle housing owners be able to use that financing, and the state definitely saw that and made that part of their.
Well, and it provides an opportunity for, theoretically, like let's just take a quadplex, for instance. You develop a quadplex. Traditionally, that would be only available to be single owner, right?
Right.
So if the single owner went through the development and didn't want to live in one of the units, then this thing would have to be basically a rental, all 4 units. And by allowing each of these 4 units to have their own, be on their own lot and be able to be financed individually, maybe 2 of the 4 are rentals, or maybe 3 of the 4 are the rentals, but it still opens up that opportunity as a single family unit would be. I mean, there's lots of single family homes that are rentals. So, but there's also the opportunity for it to be owner occupied. I think moving forward, as far as creating affordability, that's huge.
Yeah, totally. It makes me think of another important point is that we don't really have any developers of fourplexes in our building industry anymore.
That's right.
They might have existed 50 years ago, but these days, housing developers are polarized just the way our zoning has been. You got your single family developers, and then you've got our big apartment developers.
Commercial, right.
So it's going to take some time for developers to move into this new territory. And I think a lot of people get worried that we're just going to start seeing this overnight transformation of our neighborhood to the point that it's going to be unrecognizable or something. And it's just not the case. Again, the same height limitations are going to apply that have always been in effect with a small addition of 5 feet, a little bit more lot coverage, but we're talking about housing that's often going to be smaller than a garage for an RV that somebody might build in their backyard.
That's right.
And the developers that are going to develop that are not readily at hand. The builders that are going to build it are not readily at hand. All that stuff's going to take some time to find its way through this new opened up territory.
Yeah, and I think one thing that was really interesting when we were talking about this before we started the show today, this point that you made where the density, i.e. the number of people that are living, don't necessarily equal some huge structure. Like I keep on coming back to your C Street, which we will talk about, folks. Don't worry. We'll talk about C Street in Springfield here in a minute. But, that development started out as a single family home.
Yeah.
And you added what would have been maybe called an ADU and allowed for 6 units, correct?
Yeah. 6 suites. Yeah.
Yeah, 6 suites. So, but it is not some huge structure. You drive by that and it maintains the character of the neighborhood, in my opinion. And like your example of the big box McMansion that is 4,000 square feet that a single family is going to live in, you could easily turn that into a quadplex as far as the same area in the, same size structure, right?
Yeah.
So same structure, just more density.
Exactly.
So it's not that scary, folks. You know? And like you're saying, Dylan, it's going to take a while for these developments to actually, make sense and for people to even have the imagination to do some of the things that you're doing already.
Right. Yeah. That classic example of the large McMansion could be a fourplex. That's 4 times the density, which sounds scary.
Totally.
If you get up and wave a flag and they're quadrupling the density of our city. Well, but it might actually look exactly the same. Yeah. It just means you've got 4 times as many families that are able to live there.
That's right. And hopefully more affordability.
Yeah, right? Absolutely. Yeah.
Because we're, the crux of the matter right now is in most markets right now, and I kind of use the caveat of in places that people want to live, right? The hot markets are hot because people want to live there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And those markets are hot also because there's higher demand than there is supply. And, that was another thing we were talking about earlier is this crazy supply and demand just in the state of Oregon, this disparity where you were saying like 30,000 units, or is that we need
what we need to build? Yeah. 30 to 40,000 units per year is what Oregon statewide needs to develop over the next 2 decades to catch up with kind of the backlog of missing supply.
The next 2 decades.
Over the next 2 decades. Yeah.
Or 300,000 houses. Right?
Yeah. 584,000 houses is what we need in the next 20 years.
Wow.
Statewide. Yeah. We really need housing. We need any and all housing. We especially need smaller housing because we have smaller households. That's the important thing to understand is 50 years ago, the average house size was 3+ people, but now we're having less and less kids per family. We're at just over 2 average household size of 2 people. So we don't need 5-bedroom homes anymore. Right. We don't need large lot homes anymore. Many people don't want them. The AARP is a huge endorser of this kind of legislation because they see there's not only a huge need for starter homes among young professionals, there's also a huge need for downsizers that are just not there. They want to stay in their neighborhood. So we really need lots of added housing diversity.
Hallelujah. I agree.
Yeah.
So listen, I think it's time to talk about C Street.
All right, let's do it. That's my favorite topic.
Yeah. So, I mean, for those of you that aren't familiar with this missing middle housing, you did an amazing project in Springfield last year, which was, this is your passion project. This is why you came to Eugene. And this was kind of like a pilot project. And I think it has not gotten enough press. So let's, talk, because this is exactly addressing these issues of this middle housing. So,
and I think
tell us about it.
Yeah. And I think it's a good case study of the kind of development we might start to see. I hope we start to see with the middle housing laws. So, John Fisher, a local infamous character in our community, used to be the weatherman. I love walking down the street with him because every other person waves to him like they know him. And it took me a while. I didn't at first know he used to be the weatherman because I'm not from here,
Totally.
And he explained it to me.
Yeah.
But he had a double wide lot in not far from downtown Springfield. It was 90 feet wide. And that just barely allowed it to be subdivided. In fact, if it had been a quarter inch less wide when the surveyor actually did his subdivision, we wouldn't have been able to develop it, which is
another story.
Fortunately, I didn't know that till after we'd paid the $15,000 to do it.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah. Development's it can be a risky game.
Yeah. Scary for sure. Well, I mean, you're blazing new trails. And so,
So I haven't eaten dirt yet, but we'll see. So we subdivided the lot, 6-month process. I was not prepared for that. A lot of money, but from that, we were able to put the existing 3-bedroom home on its own lot. And then we carved out a new, basically blank slate, had nothing on it, barely, I think a dying tree and a lilac bush. But it was otherwise flat, a perfect south-facing property. I had alley access.
Nice.
So we were able to do, again, this is pre-middle housing legislation. So all the laws would allow us to do at the time were a house and an ADU. Fortunately, Springfield had waived system development charges, which are a big chunk
for
of
ADUs,
fees for ADUs. Yeah. Right. So that definitely helped out.
And that was actually because of the Senate bill that was requiring more permissible building codes.
Exactly. ADUs were required by law statewide. This predates the middle housing legislation. And then again, an example of a community deciding to go further. Unlike Eugene, Springfield waived the SDC fees for ADUs because they want to see more of them.
Right.
So we said, I partnered with Square One Villages, a local housing nonprofit, on this, and we kind of looked at it and said, we need to find a pathway here to do more affordable housing that is pushing the bounds of what we're currently seeing. Right. Because we're just not doing enough. And so what we did is, a common sense way people save money on their housing is by sharing housing, right? Well, why don't we just design the housing to be shared?
In a way where people could have more autonomy over their living situation rather than just a bunch of traditional bedrooms where you're sharing one bathroom and bumping into each other and having to share the kitchen and whatnot.
Exactly. Yeah. So essentially we carved the housing in the house we have 4 private suites, and in the ADU we have 2. They're basically like a luxury suite in a hotel with a little kitchenette bar. Right. And the city didn't allow us to do an oven because that essentially triggers a full kitchen, right? So, which wouldn't be allowed. But so we did that, and about half the homeowners that are there now miss the oven, and about half don't. So that was pretty interesting to see. Yeah. But basically, in terms of the cost, it was pretty tremendous. One, we were able to develop it as a housing cooperative. So that each of those 6 suites is owner occupied. Each of the residents is a part owner of the entire property. Right. And then Square One maintains land ownership as a land trust to ensure that the housing remains permanently affordable. Right. And when I say affordable, I mean affordable. The housing units cost $10,000 total purchase price. And the total monthly payments, utilities, maintenance, everything, $790 a month. For a 1-bedroom suite, that's pretty tremendous.
Yeah, it is.
And we did that for about half the development cost of a typical affordable housing development, and for only 10% of the subsidy. So, a big part of that is that we didn't have to purchase commercial property to develop multifamily building on, because that's a limited.
And you had to go with residential code instead of commercial codes.
Exactly. Yeah.
Residential materials versus some commercial materials, sprinkler systems and all that stuff.
Exactly.
So it all adds up. So
it's a really great case study of how you can make inherently affordable housing when you keep it simple and you let that kind of housing exist, just like you let regular single family housing get built.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty exciting. And so I guess some of the questions that I would have with it is, how did you overcome like the parking situation, since clearly this is prior to some of the newer legislation, and how so far are folks doing? I mean, it's been since November of last year, right? So,
September.
So how, I'm sure you've checked in on how everybody's doing. Like,
yeah, really good. Actually, the place feels really nice. I took tamales over there and we had a little this is during the pandemic, of course, so we had an outdoor tamale party. Yeah,
socially distant outdoor tamale party.
And it was really, really nice to connect with everybody. Yeah, so far, great. Everybody seems to really love their unit. They're small, they're 1-bedroom micro suites. They're 384 square feet each, so it's about as small as you can possibly make a 1-bedroom space with a full bathroom.
But there's tons of people. Well, maybe not tons of people. There are people that are living in tiny homes that are smaller square footage than those units. So it's still a fairly decent habitable space when it comes to this micro housing.
Yeah. And there are plenty of people that are sharing a bedroom or living in a bedroom in a shared house because that's all they can afford. And so this is a step up from that in terms of privacy.
Totally. So how did they finance those?
You asked about parking. I'll just quickly mention, we were able to do a 2-space driveway in the front, and then we have alley access, so we have 2 parking spaces in the back.
Oh, brilliant.
They ended up not using the alley parking so much, and they have ended up parking 3 cars in the driveway in the front. So, but they seem to make it work.
And has the neighborhood embraced this development? Did you get much pushback from the neighbors?
We've only heard from people that love it. That's so,
which is usually the other way around.
Yeah,
usually the people that love it just walk by and wave and smile. It's the ones that aren't happy about it that you usually hear from. So that's good.
It really is in scale with the rest of the houses in the neighborhood. It's only 2 stories. It's well below what you could have built in terms of the building height. It's less lot coverage than you could have built. So in that way, it feels really good. It's really in keeping with a single family neighborhood scale. And yet it's, by the numbers, 48 households per acre, which is easily around 4 times the density limit of current low density zoning.
Right.
So again, 4 times the density, and it looks pretty much like any other house in the neighborhood.
Yeah, that's amazing. So you have another development in Springfield that you're going to get going on, your F Street development. And I know you're still kind of working out because it's a kind of totally different situation in some respects. So what can you tease us with what the direction you're going to go with that one and what that's going to look like?
Yeah, as much as I'm able. I still don't know a lot. I'm still in the kind of a conceptual phase on that one. A big part of it is we kind of put everything on pause to wait till the middle housing laws got passed,
so that you could enjoy some of the loosening up of things like parking and whatnot.
Exactly. Yeah. We've also been really, as with C Street, we're actively in conversation with the city of Springfield planning staff, as well as Square One Villages, to try and find kind of that nexus between affordable housing and the kind of housing that Springfield wants to support, which of course is affordable housing. But, for example, Springfield is holding on to their off-street parking requirements a little tighter than Eugene is. So we're having to work with that. I would say, where I'm at literally today, I was working on it, is I've got about 12 options of one of the unfortunate parts about this new middle housing zoning laws is it's pretty complicated in terms of you've got these 4 pathways to what you develop, whether you call it a 4-plex or 4 townhouses. is it means different set of standards, even though the built form might be exactly the same.
Totally.
So you've got that side of the zoning. You've also got building code, which looks at things in a completely different way when it decides whether to apply residential building code or commercial building code. And so
back to the quadplex versus the townhomes.
Exactly.
You get to a quadplex, you're in commercial requirements, whereas your individual townhomes, they're single family units, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what this whole process has led me to realize is, and this might be the nugget to really share, is I've decided I'm going to host a building middle housing workshop.
Yes,
because no one should have to go through the brain damage
that you're doing.
that I've gone through.
Do not recreate the wheel. Dylan has created some of that, so that's great. So what? And that will be for potential other developers, right?
For homeowners, for developers, for other architects, basically anybody that's interested in doing middle housing.
Sign me up.
Yeah.
When are you going to do that?
As soon as I can put it together.
Okay, fair enough.
Give me a month or two.
Fair enough. Yeah. Well, so go ahead.
One more thing I want to mention is the really important, the middle housing testimony. Public hearing is happening this coming Monday.
I was just going to.
Oh, okay. All right. Sorry.
We were on the same wavelength here. I was going to say, I wanted to come full circle to talk about this forum that's going to be there. So, go ahead. Sorry to interrupt you.
You looked like you had to wind it up.
No, I was going to wind it up, but we needed to, get back around the corner to this last point here.
Yeah. So this is the kind of the culmination of a more than 2-year process of Eugene deciding how they're going to implement this new state law. And the big public hearing is this coming Monday, April 18th at 7:30 p.m. via Zoom.
That was April 18th.
18th at 7:30 p.m. via Zoom. People will have around a couple of minutes to testify. For folks that have never testified before, it's really low barrier to entry. Like really, what the city really wants to hear is your perspective.
Yep.
And you don't have to know all the laws. You don't have to have your head deeply in the code to just show up and say, look, we need more housing. Because there are a lot of people that show up that have entrenched views about, they've been living in their home for 40 years and they don't want to see change. And those people tend to mobilize, I would say, more than the young 20-somethings that are really being crushed by the housing crisis right now. So,
well, and when you've been priced out of the market, you're actually not in the game.
Right.
Yeah. So you don't necessarily have this same sort of impact, and it doesn't even occur to you. So how do people find the pathway to be able to do that?
Totally. Just Google Eugene Middle Housing and you'll find the city's put together a really great website that's got all the information about the public hearing and how to testify. You can also send an email. If you can't make that date, just send an email. They've got a form there. And they've also got the Planning Commission recommendations if you want to dive in and kind of understand the laws more intimately. But I'm going to encourage folks to try and make their voice heard because we really need.
And they can email in. They don't actually have to, if they're shy and they don't want to hop on the Zoom, they could email in and the actual Zoom testimony is limited to 5 minutes. Is that correct?
It'll probably be around 2 minutes per person.
2 minutes per person.
Yeah, it's bound to be a full crowd of people, and so it usually goes to 10 p.m. And sometimes
we went to one live back in the day.
Yeah,
so
that's right.
They can be a hoot. So and how do folks that are interested in this, and if you've been listening to the program and you are interested in more information about maybe developing your property for a process like this, you want to reach out to Dylan Lamar at Cultivate Inc. How do they get a hold of you?
So my website's cultivateplace.com, cultivateplace.com, and there's a contact form there.
Perfect.
They can reach out.
Perfect. And if you can't find him, you always can find me at Lore Real Estate. And so I got to say, this was one of my more fun interviews that I've done since we started the podcast. Any parting thoughts you want to share with anybody?
I just appreciate you taking an interest in this. It's always fun to, I spend a lot of my time in a specialized world talking with people about how to influence public policy at this kind of higher level, not higher, but more specialized level. And it's really fun to get down to brass tacks with people on the ground and talk about like how this is actually going to impact people's lives.
Well, and I think,
really
for most people that aren't embedded in it, there's this periphery of like semi understanding of these concepts, and you can develop an opinion without actually really knowing what's going on. And it impacts us all. I'm as passionate about this as you, in that our community is ready for, kind of rolling up our sleeves and starting to address some of these issues, because it filters through all of the socioeconomic groups, and it transcends race. It's really, it affects us all. And so it's a global issue, and you are nose deep in it and absolutely an expert on the subject. So I think what would be really great, I'm not going to put it, well, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but, we've been talking about Eugene today, and obviously we represent, my company represents Bend as well. I might have you come back on and do a similar presentation, because, the thing that's interesting about this is each city really is carving their own path here. This, the state says, okay, here's your minimum, that you got to carve it out this way at bare minimum. And then the cities are kind of doing these different things. Like with the ADUs, Bend 2 years before the state mandated this, started, waiving SDCs, and, the city of Bend made it so incentivize people to create density through building ADUs that we went from like 1 or 2 permits a year in Bend to like 300 to 400 permits for ADUs. Yeah. And then you got Eugene, which went completely the other direction with this ADU issue. Springfield, that was more in line with Bend, but, wasn't motivated until the state kind of had something to say. So it's interesting to see how, these different municipalities are, in some ways, like Springfield was more permissive with the ADUs, but now they're giving you a little bit more of a pushback on parking, whereas the city of Eugene now has been less permissive with ADUs, but now they're, a little more permissive with the parking situation. So it'd be interesting to get,
we hope, depending on city council's vote.
Okay, fair
City
enough.
Council has completely thrown out planning commission's work before. Sadly.
Well, okay, fair enough. So anyway, I guess best case scenario, just understanding what some of these different communities are doing, and is kind of fun. But again, I want to thank you for being on the show today, and you are welcome back anytime.
I'd love to come back. Thanks so much, Kip.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us today on the Real Estate Revolution podcast. As always, I'm Kip Lohr, your host with Lohr Real Estate, and we're going to have another exciting show next week. So make sure you tune in. Thanks again.
Thank you for joining The Revolution. We are over and out until next week, when we'll continue to fill you in on all that matters most in our local Bend and Eugene real estate scenes. See you next time on The Real Estate Revolution.